I used to photograph the odometer on my wife's Honda Civic every time I left for a long-haul run. It started as a habit back in 2019 when we bought the car used from a dealership on Kingston Pike in Knoxville for $14,200. And I wanted to keep track of the oil change intervals because Sarah always forgot to write down the mileage when she went in for service. Every Monday or Tuesday morning before a trip, I'd walk out to the Civic in our gravel driveway, lean into the open driver's door, snap a quick photo of the dashboard on my phone, and then climb into my Peterbilt 579, kiss Sarah goodbye through the window, and pull onto the county road heading for the highway. We lived in a 3-bedroom ranch on 2 acres outside Maryville, Tennessee, bought in 2013 for $168,000 with a 30-year fixed mortgage and a payment of $1,140 a month. We'd been married 11 years by the time the odometer habit became something more than bookkeeping. We had no children, not by choice. We tried for 7 of those 11 years, 7 years of ovulation kits and timed intimacy, and the particular humiliation of turning the most private act between 2 people into a medical procedure governed by calendar dates and basal body temperatures. When the natural approach failed, we drove to a fertility clinic in Nashville, a place with soft lighting and watercolor paintings designed to feel hopeful, but that mostly felt expensive. The first round of IVF cost $12,800. The second cost $10,200. $23,000 total, pulled from our savings one agonizing check at a time, while insurance covered nothing. Both cycles failed. In the spring of 2019, the specialist sat us down and delivered the verdict. Unexplained infertility. No identifiable cause, just biology that refused to cooperate despite every intervention medicine could offer. Sarah cried in the clinic parking lot for 40 minutes while I held her hand and stared at a Chick-fil-A across the road, unable to produce a single useful word. That was the year I stopped believing the universe owed us anything. Sarah took it harder than I did, or at least she showed it in ways I could see, while I buried my grief under route miles and fuel receipts. She'd been working part-time reception at a veterinary clinic in Alcoa, and after the second IVF failure, she simply stopped going. Called in one Monday and never returned. I didn't push it because I could see the weight pressing down on her, changing the way she moved through our house, turning the hallway past the nursery into a corridor she hurried through with averted eyes. We'd painted that room pale yellow the summer before the first cycle. Sarah on a stepladder, me taping baseboards, both of us laughing about names. I liked Ellie for a girl. She wanted Thomas for a boy, after her grandfather. After the second failure, I moved the crib and the changing table and the boxes of tiny clothes into the garage while Sarah was out, and I turned the room into storage for Christmas decorations and old tax documents. She never mentioned it. She just closed the door one afternoon, and we both understood. The grief reshaped our marriage in ways I didn't recognize at the time, because the changes came so slowly they felt like weather, not events. We stopped having dinner at the kitchen table and started eating on the couch in front of the television, which meant we stopped looking at each other while we ate, which meant conversations became shorter and shallower and eventually optional. We stopped touching casually, the way married people do when they move around a kitchen together, a hand on a hip, a shoulder brush in the hallway. The bedroom became a place for sleeping and nothing else. And then it became a place where 2 people slept in the same bed, but occupied separate territories of mattress, with a cold channel down the middle that neither of us acknowledged. I think we were both afraid that if we reached across that channel, we'd have to talk about why it existed. And we'd already proven we didn't have the vocabulary for that conversation. So we just kept the TV on, and the voices small, and the silences comfortable enough to survive inside. Being a long-haul trucker means your entire existence runs on numbers. Miles per gallon, hours of service, weight limits at the scales, axle spacing for state regulations, fuel costs per mile, deadhead percentages that eat into your paycheck if you're not careful. I drove for a regional carrier out of Chattanooga called Ridgeline Freight, pulling dry van loads between Tennessee, Georgia, Alabama, and the Carolinas. The pay was about $65,000 a year, with overtime and bonuses for clean DOT inspections, and I'd been with them since I was 26, which meant seniority and decent route selections. Our insurance ran $186 a month. Utilities averaged $220 in summer and $310 in winter with the electric heat pump. I could cover everything if I picked up an extra run or two each month. So that's what I did when the grief settled into our house like fog that wouldn't lift. I drove more. I came home less. I told myself I was providing, even though providing for just 2 people in a small Tennessee town doesn't require 60-hour weeks on the highway. Sarah started doing bookkeeping from home for a local landscaping company, about 15 hours a week, mostly invoicing and payroll on her laptop at the kitchen table. It brought in roughly $800 a month and gave her a reason to be upright by 9 in the morning. We fell into a routine that looked stable on the outside but felt hollow underneath, like a bridge that still carries traffic while cracks spread unseen through its supports. I'd leave Monday, drive 2 to 4 days, come home, mow the lawn, grill chicken thighs on our rusty Weber, leave again. In the evenings, we watched television and talked about the house, the weather, the neighbor's beagle that kept tipping our trash cans on collection day. What we did not talk about was the nursery, the IVF, the baby we would never have. We'd sealed that subject in a box and pushed it to the back of a closet, and every day we walked past that closet pretending we couldn't hear the sound coming from inside. It was the first week of March 2023 when I noticed the mileage discrepancy. I'd left Monday morning for a standard 2-day turnaround to Atlanta, hauling automotive parts to a distribution center in Marietta. Before I left, I photographed Sarah's odometer, 67,342 miles. When I returned Wednesday evening, parked my rig at the Ridgeline yard, and drove home in my F-150, I went outside to move Sarah's Civic into the garage ahead of a thunderstorm. I opened her door and glanced at the dash. The odometer showed 67,558. That was 216 miles in 2 days. Sarah worked from home. The Kroger was 3 miles away. Her friend Donna lived 8 miles across town. Even her mother in Knoxville was only 40 miles, 80 round trip. No arithmetic I could construct accounted for 216 miles in a life bounded by Maryville. I didn't say anything that evening. I told myself she'd probably combined several errands into one long drive. Maybe she went to Knoxville and back twice. I was reaching for innocent explanations the way a drowning man reaches for anything that floats. I photographed the odometer again the following Monday before a run to Greenville, South Carolina. Drove 2 days through Appalachian foothills, delivered my load at a textile warehouse, and headed home Thursday through mountain roads where the spring leaves were just starting to green along the ridge lines. When I checked the Civic in our driveway, the odometer showed another 203 added miles. I sat in my F-150 and scrolled through our joint bank account on my phone. Kroger, $47.82 on Tuesday. Walgreens, $12.16. Then a charge that stopped me cold. Pilot gas station, Wednesday afternoon, $38.50. Sarah always fueled up at the Murphy USA by the Walmart because it was the cheapest pump in town by 4 or 5 cents a gallon. She was particular about that. She had no reason to buy gas at a Pilot on the interstate. I found the station on Google Maps. It was on I-40 near Cookeville, roughly halfway between Maryville and somewhere I could not yet name. 200 miles, a gas station she never used, a Wednesday pattern. The shape of something I didn't want to see was forming at the edges of my vision. That evening at dinner, I asked casually what she'd done while I was away. She said she'd mostly stayed home. Bookkeeping, Netflix, coffee at Donna's on Tuesday. She didn't mention driving anywhere. Not Cookeville, not I-40, not any errand that could explain 200 miles. She looked me in the eyes while she spoke, cutting chicken on her plate with steady hands, her voice warm. The same voice that had said, "I do," in a church in Sevier County 11 years ago. I ate my dinner and washed the dishes and sat with her on the couch watching a nature documentary and said nothing. My parents' marriage had taught me what happens when you throw accusations without proof. My father suspected my mother of lying 100 times. He was right about half. But being right didn't save anything. It just made the destruction feel like justice, which is the most dangerous kind of destruction there is, because it makes you think you won something, when in fact, you lost everything. The next 3 weeks I gathered data with the only tools I trusted: patience, precision, and math. Every departure, I photographed the odometer. Every return, I photographed it again. I built a spreadsheet with columns for departure date, return date, starting mileage, ending mileage, and the difference. Over 5 trips in 21 days, the numbers formed a pattern as clear as lane markings on a highway. Each time I was gone more than one night, Sarah added between 190 and 220 miles to the car. The variation was always within a 30-mile range, meaning a single, consistent destination rather than random driving. A 200-mile round trip placed the endpoint approximately 97 to 100 miles from our house. I sat in my Peterbilt sleeper berth at a truck stop near Dalton, Georgia, at 11 p.m., engine ticking as it cooled, and stared at those numbers on my phone. I wasn't angry, not yet. But something cold and heavy had settled into the lowest part of my stomach, and it wasn't going anywhere. I cross-referenced the fuel receipts. Sarah used our joint debit card for everything, so each charge appeared on the banking app within minutes. Over those weeks, she'd refueled at the Pilot near Cookeville twice, and at a Shell in Crossville once. Both stations sat on the same corridor heading northwest along I-40. I traced a line on Google Maps from Maryville through those stations and extended it 100 miles. The line ended among a cluster of small towns between Cookeville and Livingston: Gainsboro, Salina, Red Boiling Springs. Towns I'd driven past hundreds of times without ever stopping. The detail that cinched it was the day. Every fuel purchase fell on a Wednesday, every single one. Sarah was driving somewhere specific, on a specific day, to a point roughly 100 miles from home. Every week I was gone long enough for her to do it undetected. The pattern was so clean it was almost mechanical, and something about its precision made it worse, because it meant she'd been doing this methodically, reliably, for a long time. I thought about those Wednesday mornings I'd been hundreds of miles south, checking my mirrors on I-75, or backing a 53-foot trailer into a dock in Marietta, while my wife was on the same interstate I drove every single week, heading in the opposite direction toward a destination I'd never imagined. I thought about the phone calls we'd had on those Wednesday evenings, the ones where she told me about quiet days and Netflix shows and walks around the neighborhood while I sat in the cab of my truck eating gas station sandwiches and missing her. I thought about her voice on those calls, how steady and natural it sounded, how there was never a pause or a catch or an inflection that might have tipped me off. She was good at this. She had practiced. And the realization that my wife of 11 years had become fluent in a language of deception that I couldn't even detect made me feel like the ground had shifted beneath me in a way I would never be able to correct. I did not confront her. Confrontation without evidence is just accusation, and I'd watched that pattern destroy my parents' marriage when I was 14. Instead of asking questions, I went shopping for answers. On a Saturday while Sarah was at Donna's, I drove to the Walmart in Alcoa and bought a magnetic GPS tracker from the electronics aisle for $49.99. Small black box the size of a playing card deck, with a built-in SIM card and a companion app offering real-time tracking, route history, and movement alerts pushed to my phone. Battery life, approximately 2 weeks. I paid cash so the purchase wouldn't appear on our joint account. Drove home, made a sandwich, and waited for Sarah to come back and go upstairs for her evening shower. When I heard the water running through the ceiling, I walked outside into a Tennessee twilight that smelled like cut grass and honeysuckle from the fence line. I crouched behind the Civic and pressed the tracker's magnetic mount to the steel underside of the rear bumper. It connected with a click that felt louder than it was. I stood up and brushed the grit from my knees, and my hands were shaking. Not from the cold, because it was still 65 degrees and the evening air was soft, but from the knowledge that I had crossed a line that I could not uncross. I had placed a surveillance device on my wife's vehicle. That sentence, no matter how I constructed it in my head, sounded like something from a courtroom transcript, not from the life of a man who had stood in a church 11 years ago and promised to love and trust another person until one of them died. But trust had already been broken. The question was only whether I could prove it, and what I would do with the proof once I had it. I wiped my palms on my jeans and tried to steady my breathing, and reminded myself that I was a man who lived by numbers, and the numbers had been lying to me, and it was time to find out why. I looked at our house in the dying light. Peeling shutters I kept meaning to scrape and repaint. The flower bed by the front steps that Sarah had planted 3 springs ago with marigolds and petunias, now overrun with crabgrass because neither of us could muster the energy to tend things that needed tending. A porch light casting a yellow circle on the gravel. A neighbor grilling something 2 houses down, blue smoke drifting across our yard. I stood there in the silence of a small town settling into evening, looking at a house that once contained every hope I had for the future and now contained something I was terrified to examine. And I thought, none of this was supposed to happen. Not the empty nursery, not the GPS tracker under my wife's car, not the cold dread sitting in my chest. None of it. But it had happened, and the tracker was in place, and there was no undoing any of it. Monday morning, I left for Charlotte, hauling household goods. Kissed Sarah goodbye at 5:45 a.m., told her I loved her, heard her mumble it back through sleep-heavy lips. I drove east on I-40 in pre-dawn darkness and waited for Wednesday. At 9:47 a.m., sitting in a rest area near Asheville with fog lifting off the Blue Ridge, my phone buzzed. Movement alert. I opened the app and watched the blue dot crawl northwest along I-40. Past Harriman, past Crossville, past the Pilot in Cookville. At 11:23 a.m., the dot stopped on a residential street in a town called Gainesboro, Tennessee. Population 953. I zoomed in on the satellite view. A house on Maple Lane. Small ranch, vinyl siding, chain-link fence, a workshop beside the garage. I stared at that motionless blue dot and felt something lock into place behind my ribs with a finality that left no room for alternative explanations. It was the sound of a thing ending. I set my phone down and sat in the rest area for a long time. Trucks came and went around me, air brakes hissing, drivers walking their dogs on the grass median. A woman in a Freightliner 2 spaces over, waving to someone on a video call. Normal people doing normal things on a normal Wednesday morning, while my life rearranged itself into a shape I didn't recognize. I thought about calling Sarah right then, about asking her directly who lived at that address on Maple Lane. But I knew what she would say. She would say she didn't know what I was talking about, or she would say it was a friend, or she would say something that sounded true enough to make me doubt the blue dot on my screen, and I would be back to square one with nothing but suspicion and a $49 tracker. I needed more than a dot. I needed a name, a face, a reason. And I needed to be calm when I got them. I pulled the Peterbilt onto I-40 and drove 4 hours to Charlotte in absolute silence. No radio, no CB, no phone calls. Just the Cummins diesel and 18 tires on asphalt and a roar inside my head that drowned everything else. The blue dot sat motionless on Maple Lane for 4 hours and 12 minutes. I know that exact duration because I checked the app every 30 minutes at the Charlotte Distribution Center while dock workers unloaded my trailer. I sat on the front bumper eating a granola bar, staring at a dot that wouldn't move on a street in a town so small it probably didn't have a traffic light. 4 hours and 12 minutes. What do 2 people do in a house for 4 hours on a Wednesday afternoon? I knew the answer. I just couldn't let myself form the words yet, because forming them would make them real, and real was a country I wasn't ready to immigrate to. At 3:35 p.m., the dot finally began moving, tracing the identical route southeast through Cookville, Crossville, Harriman, and home. Sarah pulled into our driveway at 5:48 p.m. I called her that evening from a Love's travel stop off I-77 in South Carolina, sitting in my sleeper berth with the cab lights off, my voice steady through an act of will I didn't know I was capable of. She said she'd had a quiet day. Bookkeeping, a walk in the nice weather, nothing special. We discussed the gutters and the spring rains and whether we should call that guy Donna's husband had recommended for the job. I said the right words in the right places, while my laptop screen showed the GPS route. A clean red ribbon from Maryville to Gainsboro, 97.3 miles each way, no deviation, no unplanned stops, no hesitation at any intersection. The route of someone who had driven it so many times she no longer needed navigation. The way I drove I-40 from Maryville to Knoxville on muscle memory alone. Eyes forward, mind elsewhere. The road so familiar it had become invisible. That night at the Love's travel stop, I parked in the back row, away from the other trucks, and sat in my sleeper berth in the dark. The truck stop hummed with the usual nighttime sounds, diesel generators, the beeping of a backing trailer, music leaking from someone's cab 3 spaces over. I stared at the ceiling of my Peterbilt and thought about every Wednesday for the past 9 months, working backward through the calendar in my head, counting. 36 Wednesdays, roughly. 36 drives of 97 miles each way. That was nearly 7,000 miles my wife had driven to a house in a town I'd never visited, while I was earning a living on the same interstate she used to get there. 7,000 miles of deception, each one logged in the odometer I'd been photographing like a man documenting his own betrayal without knowing it. I'd been collecting the evidence all along. I just hadn't been reading it. I needed to know who lived at that house. Part of me still wanted innocence. An old friend, a relative, some explanation I could live with. I spent the following evening in my sleeper berth with my laptop. A property records search on the Jackson County Assessor's website showed the Maple Lane house belonged to Gregory Allen Whitfield, age 44. Facebook told the rest. Greg Whitfield was a divorced high school shop teacher at Jackson County High in Gainsboro. His profile picture showed a thin man with glasses and a short beard, standing beside a black Labrador on a porch I recognized from Google Street View. His posts were ordinary: woodworking articles, muddy dog photos, a bookshelf built from reclaimed barnwood. Then I found what I'd been looking for without knowing I was looking for it. In his groups section, Paths Forward, support for couples and individuals facing infertility. A private group, about 1,200 members, describing itself as a safe space for people navigating infertility and pregnancy loss. I read the name 3 times and closed the laptop. I sat in the dark cab, listening to interstate traffic and the idle of the neighboring rig, and the sound of my own heart hammering against my chest wall. And the entire picture assembled itself in a single, devastating instant. Sarah had joined a support group for infertility. She'd met Greg there, a man whose infertility had ended his marriage just as ours was being hollowed out by the same condition. They'd connected through the one wound they shared, the wound that was supposed to belong to Sarah and me alone. I could see it all unfolding. Comments in the group thread, then private messages, then phone calls on Wednesday evenings while I was parked at truck stops asking her about the weather. Then the first drive to Gainsboro, rationalized as friendship, just 2 people who understood each other's particular version of loss. Then the second drive, then the third. And then the drives became a habit, and the habit became a life, and the life ran parallel to the one she was living with me, like 2 highway lanes that look identical from a distance, but are heading in completely different directions. The cruelest part wasn't the betrayal. It was the weapon, our shared wound. The childlessness that we'd cried over in clinic waiting rooms and fought about in our kitchen and spent $23,000 trying to cure. She'd taken that sacred, private grief and carried it across a bridge to another man, a man who could sit with her inside the pain because he lived in the same country of loss that she did. I didn't cry that night in the truck. The tears wouldn't come. What came instead was a terrible clarity, like the moment before a highway wreck when everything goes slow motion and you can see the other vehicle crossing the center line and there's no room to swerve, and all you can do is grip the wheel and wait for the impact. I sat in that clarity for a long time. Then I opened my phone and started searching for private investigators. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the sleeper berth, watching the glow of the truck stop lights through the curtain, and listening to the highway traffic and running calculations in my head, the way I always do when I'm trying to process something too large for feelings alone. 9 months of weekly visits. That was longer than some of the marriages I'd heard truckers talk about at loading docks and rest areas. Men who'd gotten married fast and divorced faster. Sarah hadn't stumbled into an affair on a drunken night. She'd built a second life, methodically, on a schedule, 97 miles from the life she was supposed to be living with me. The precision of it was what gutted me. She hadn't been careless. She hadn't left evidence except the mileage, and even that she'd assumed I'd never notice because who photographs an odometer every week? I did. And that single habit, born of nothing more consequential than wanting to track oil changes, was now the thread that was about to unravel everything we'd built together. I found Cumberland Investigations in Knoxville, run by Dale Presley, a former Knox County Sheriff's deputy with 12 years in the PI business. Good website, 4.8 Google stars, specialty in domestic surveillance. I called him from a rest area on I-85 outside Spartanburg and explained my situation in flat, clinical terms, the way you describe a mechanical failure to a diesel mechanic. He listened without interrupting, then quoted $175 per hour plus mileage, estimating $2,100 to $2,500 for a standard package, including photographs, a timeline, and a court-ready report. I said yes. The money would come from our savings, the account Sarah and I called the Someday Fund, back when someday still meant a baby. It held about $11,000. I wired Dale $2,100 from a Wendy's parking lot in Spartanburg, eating a Baconator that tasted like nothing, looking at a receipt that represented the price of confirming what I already knew. Every trucker understands the difference between suspecting your brakes are going and having a mechanic document it on an inspection form. One is a feeling, the other is a fact. Facts are what courts require. Dale began surveillance the following Wednesday. I was hauling flooring to Savannah, so he texted photographs throughout the day. He'd positioned his unmarked dark blue Tahoe on Maple Lane before dawn, 3 houses from the Whitfield property, with clear sightlines to the driveway and porch. At 11:18 a.m., Sarah's white Civic turning into the driveway. At 11:22, Sarah stepping out, smoothing her hair, walking to the porch in jeans and a green blouse I recognized from our bedroom closet. At 11:24, Greg Whitfield opening his front door to greet her. Then the photograph I will carry behind my eyelids for the rest of my life. They embraced on the porch. Dale's text was clinical. Full body embrace, approximately 15 seconds. Subject's hands on female's lower back. Female's face turned into subject's neck. I read those words in the cab of my truck surrounded by forklifts and the smell of stacked pine lumber, and I looked at the photograph until my vision blurred, and then I looked at it some more. The next image showed them walking through the front door together, his hand resting on the small of her back. The door closed at 11:26 a.m. It did not reopen for over 4 hours. At 3:41 p.m., Sarah walked out alone, paused on the porch looking back through the doorway with the body language of someone reluctant to leave, then got in the Civic and drove away. Dale captured everything with the professional detachment of a man who documents the demolition of marriages for a living. I put my phone face down and drove to the loading dock. The foreman asked if I was all right. I said I was tired. The lie was smooth and automatic, which frightened me. I'd been listening to Sarah deliver the same quality of casual dishonesty for weeks, and apparently the skill is contagious, absorbed through proximity the way you pick up an accent from the people around you without ever deciding to. I sat with those photographs for hours that night in the Savannah truck stop, flipping between them on my phone, zooming in on details I didn't want to see but couldn't stop examining. The way Sarah's hair fell across her face as she walked up the porch steps, the same way it always fell, the same tilt of her head. The expression on Greg's face when he opened the door, which I could only see in partial profile, but which looked like the face of a man who was expecting someone he was glad to see. Not surprised, not tentative, just glad. The embrace that lasted 15 seconds, which doesn't sound long until you count it out in your head and realize it's an eternity on someone's front porch, in the middle of a weekday, in a small town where neighbors could be watching from any window. They didn't care who saw them. Or maybe they'd been doing this long enough that they'd stopped thinking about it. Either way, the familiarity in those photographs told a story that was older and deeper than 9 months. Dale ran surveillance on 2 additional Wednesdays. The second time, he captured Sarah and Greg in the backyard, sitting together in lawn chairs under an oak, his hand on her knee while she talked with animated gestures, the black lab asleep at their feet. The scene had the easy familiarity of something that had been happening for months. The third Wednesday, Dale followed the Civic from our driveway at 9:38 a.m., all the way to Gainesboro, documenting the entire 97-mile route with time-stamped photographs, including the fuel stop at the Pilot, where Sarah charged $41.12 to our joint card. He also ran a background check on Greg Whitfield. Clean record, no criminal history, just a 2020 divorce in Jackson County, citing irreconcilable differences. An ordinary man who'd lost his marriage to the same condition that was destroying mine. He hadn't pursued Sarah. They'd found each other in the wreckage of a shared catastrophe. I couldn't even hate him cleanly. Dale's final report arrived at the P.O. box I'd rented in Alcoa for $78 quarterly. 23 pages, professionally bound. 47 photographs in chronological sequence. A 6-week surveillance timeline precise to the minute. Route maps matching my own spreadsheet within a mile. Copies of bank transactions. A section titled Pattern of Contact that summarized the Wednesday visits in language that was forensically precise and personally devastating. Total bill, $2,100. I sat in my F-150 in the post office parking lot under a maple tree, reading every page, turning each photograph slowly, studying Sarah's face in each one, searching for the woman I'd married and the woman smiling at a man on a porch in Gainesboro. The faces were identical. The smile was identical. That was the cruelest discovery. She hadn't become someone else. She'd just found someone else to aim that smile at. And the person she'd stopped aiming it at was me. If Sarah had been sleeping with someone she'd met on an app or at a bar, I could have processed it with clean, uncomplicated anger. But she'd met Greg in a support group for people carrying the weight of childlessness, which meant the entry fee to the room where they found each other was the exact same wound I carried. The infertility that was supposed to bind us, the $23,000, the 7 years, had become the thing connecting her to someone else. Greg understood her grief because he'd lived it. I understood it too because I'd lived it beside her. But I was on I-45 days a week pulling freight, and Greg was in Gainesboro every Wednesday with an empty house and a patient dog and all the unhurried time 2 grieving people could need. She hadn't left me for money or excitement or youth. She'd left me for presence. For a man who was simply, consistently, physically there when I was 400 miles away worrying about load weights and fuel stops and the gutters on a house that was already half gone. There is a particular kind of knowledge that changes the temperature of everything it touches. Before the report, I had suspicion, which is cold but survivable, because suspicion contains within it the possibility that you're wrong. After the report, I had certainty, and certainty is a different kind of cold entirely. It's the cold of a January morning when you step outside and the air fills your lungs with ice, and you realize there is no warm place to retreat to, because the cold is everywhere, inside and out, and it will be cold for a long time. I drove my routes that week with the report under my seat, hauling loads between Tennessee and Georgia, making small talk with dock workers and fuel attendants, performing the motions of a normal life while carrying 47 photographs of my wife embracing another man underneath the seat cushion I was sitting on. Nobody knew. Nobody could tell. I was amazed at how easy it was to act normal when normal was the only option available. I carried the report under my driver's seat for 2 weeks. At night, I'd pull it out at dark truck stops and check the photographs by phone light, not to torture myself, but to anchor the evidence in reality, to make sure I wasn't building a case from loneliness and highway fatigue. During those weeks, I went home twice. Sarah was herself both times. She cooked dinner, asked about my roots, leaned against my shoulder on the couch. She said she was glad I was home. I nearly broke. Nearly pulled the envelope from behind the cushion and laid the photos across the coffee table like a hand of cards. I know about Gainsborough, Greg, the Wednesdays, the 4 hours behind a closed door. But Dale had been clear. Get an attorney before you speak a word. And some weak part of me wanted a few more evenings of the illusion. The illusion that we were still us. Still the couple from the church in Sevier County who meant every vow. Those 2 weeks were the strangest of my life. I'd come home, park in the driveway, walk through the front door, and see Sarah standing in the kitchen or sitting on the couch. And for a split second, I'd feel the old reflex of gladness, the automatic warmth that comes from seeing the person you've shared a home with for over a decade. And then the warmth would vanish as fast as it came, replaced by the memory of a porch embrace in Gainsborough, and I'd have to rearrange my face into something that passed for normal before she noticed the change. I got good at it, terrifyingly good. I learned that a man can eat dinner across from his wife, compliment the pot roast, discuss whether the bathroom faucet needs a new washer, kiss her goodnight, and lie in the dark beside her listening to her breathe, all while carrying in his chest a manila envelope of evidence that would end everything between them. The human capacity for sustained performance in the face of private agony is remarkable, and discovering that I possessed it gave me no comfort whatsoever. I hired Rebecca Morgan, family law, Knoxville. Late 50s, steel gray hair, $300 an hour, $3,000 retainer. She reviewed Dale's report with no visible reaction, asked precise questions about finances, property, retirement, and marriage duration, then laid out my position. Tennessee recognizes fault-based divorce. Adultery is valid grounds. Dale's evidence would impact asset division and eliminate alimony claims. Act normal for 10 days while I prepare the filing, she said. Don't confront. Don't move out. Don't change locks. Don't do anything opposing counsel could call abandonment. I drove home and spent 10 days sharing a bed and a table and a life with a woman who had broken something I was no longer sure could be repaired. 10 days of eating her cooking and watching her shows and answering her questions about highway traffic while a manila envelope sat under the seat of my truck in the driveway, 20 feet from our front door, containing 47 photographs of her walking into another man's house. The night before service, I lay awake at 2:17 a.m., green alarm clock glow the only light, listening to Sarah breathe. 11 years of breathing beside me in that bed. I remembered the first night, eating pizza on the bare mattress because furniture delivery was late, Sarah laughing, calling it indoor camping. The night after the first IVF failure, her body curved toward the wall, my forehead against her neck, both of us motionless until dawn without a word. 100 ordinary nights of thermostat negotiations and alarm clock arguments and the unremarkable rhythms of a shared existence. All ending. Not with screaming or thrown objects, but with a legal filing and a case number. I rose at 4 and sat in the kitchen in the dark, drinking coffee from the King of the Road mug she'd given me 2 birthdays back, listening to the refrigerator cycle and the county road traffic and the house's silence, which I was only now able to recognize for what it truly was. Not peace, but avoidance. Not intimacy, but the absence of confrontation, as hollow as the marriage it had been protecting. The process server arrived at 2:15 on a Tuesday. Young man in a navy polo, visibly uncomfortable. I sat in the living room with the Braves on television. Sarah opened the door, took the envelope, stood in the hallway reading the first page with her back to me. Her shoulders did not move. The announcer called a double play. Then she turned around. Not anger, not tears, not denial. Recognition. The face of someone who'd been listening for a storm and finally heard thunder. She whispered, "Ray." I said, "I know about Gainsborough. I know about Greg. I have photographs, GPS data, and a private investigator's report." She sat slowly on the hallway bench where we kept shoes and winter scarves and covered her face with both hands. Minutes passed. Baseball murmured behind me. A lawnmower started somewhere down the block. When she lowered her hands, her eyes were swollen red, but her voice was controlled. She did not deny a single thing. She said she was sorry. That it started 9 months ago in the support group. That Greg lost his marriage to infertility, too. Messages, then calls, then visits. She said she hadn't planned it. She said she still loved me. I told her those statements could not coexist. That a woman who loves her husband does not drive 194 miles round trip every Wednesday for 9 months to another man's house and call it coping. She said she knew that, and then she began crying the way I'd heard only once before, after the second IVF, a sound from somewhere deep and structural, below the ribs, below language, the sound of something foundational giving way. I sat on the couch 12 feet away and felt nothing. Not anger, not vindication, not even sadness. Just a vast, flat emptiness stretching in every direction without horizon, or shelter, or a single road leading anywhere at all. The game went to commercial. I muted the television. She asked what happened next. I told her Rebecca Morgan would be in contact. I told her to get a lawyer. I said it in a voice I didn't recognize. She went upstairs and closed the bedroom door. I sat in the muted living room for an hour, not moving, not thinking, just existing in the debris field of a marriage that had taken 11 years to build and 20 minutes to collapse. The baseball game had ended at some point. The television showed a post-game show with analysts talking about pitching rotations. I stared at the screen without seeing it. Eventually, I heard the shower start upstairs, and I thought about how strange it was that the rhythms of daily life continue even when your world has just been detonated. That a woman who has just been served divorce papers still takes a shower at her usual time because the body has habits the heart hasn't caught up with yet. I got up, walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water from the tap, drank it, and put the glass in the sink. Then I went to the garage and sat in my F-150 in the dark and called Rebecca Morgan and told her it was done. She said she'd be in touch with Sarah's attorney by end of business the next day. I said thank you. She said there was nothing to thank her for. The divorce took 4 months. Rebecca was surgical. Evidence was overwhelming. Sarah's attorney advised against contesting adultery grounds. We went to mediation. The house sold for $345,000 to a young couple expecting their first baby, an irony I registered but was too numb to react to. After the mortgage balance of $94,000, closing costs, and the realtor's 6% commission, we each received roughly $115,000. Sarah kept the Civic. I kept the F-150. Retirement was split 60-40 in my favor as primary earner. No alimony, eliminated by the documentation of adultery. 4 months to dissolve 11 years. I signed the final document in Rebecca's conference room with a pen that felt absurdly heavy and walked into the Knoxville afternoon as a legally single man, standing in a parking lot, blinking at the sunlight like someone who'd been indoors for a very long time. Sarah moved out on a September Saturday. 1 bedroom near the Maryville bypass, $825 a month. I helped carry boxes because that's how I was raised, because my hands needed something to do besides clench. She picked up our wedding photograph from the hallway table, us outside the Sevier County Church, squinting into sun, laughing about something lost to time. She looked at it, set it in a box unwrapped. When the van was full, she said she hoped I'd find happiness. I said the same and meant it. She drove away. I stood over the oil stain where her Civic had parked for 7 years and did the arithmetic. 41 years old, divorced, childless, a house under contract to people who had the thing I'd spent my marriage trying to create. I stood there until the stain blurred and I realized I was finally crying, standing alone in a gravel driveway in Maryville, Tennessee, at 2 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon, weeping for a life that had ended so quietly I wasn't sure exactly when the ending had begun. The last thing I did in that house was walk through every room with the lights on, the way a trucker does a post-trip inspection, checking every compartment and connection point before signing off. I stood in the kitchen where we'd eaten 10,000 meals. I stood in the living room where we'd watched a decade of television. I stood in the hallway outside the closed door of the room that had been a nursery for 6 months and a storage room for 5 years, and I opened it for the first time since I'd sealed it shut. The walls were still pale yellow. The carpet still had indentations from the crib legs. There was a small water stain on the ceiling in the corner that hadn't been there before. I stood in the middle of that room and let myself feel the full weight of what it represented, all the hope and all the loss. And then I turned off the light and closed the door and walked out of the house and locked it behind me and put the key in the lockbox the realtor had hung on the front doorknob. The new owners were moving in the following weekend. Their nursery would not be empty. I moved to a 1-bedroom apartment in Alcoa the next day, driving a rented U-Haul with everything I owned in the back, which wasn't much because most of the furniture had been Sarah's before the marriage, or bought jointly and allocated to her in the mediation agreement. 800 square feet, thin walls, a parking lot full of pickups at 6 every evening. I kept driving for Ridgeline because the road was the one thing that hadn't changed. Same cab, same highways. I-40 doesn't ask about your marriage. The white lines keep coming and the mile markers keep counting, and there's a comfort in that vast indifference. I drove the same routes and pulled the same loads, and the only difference was that nobody answered when I called home at night. The silence on the line wasn't the comfortable quiet of two people who've run out of things to say for the evening. It was the dead frequency of absence, of a number that rings and rings in an empty apartment, where the only living thing is a television I'd left on, so I wouldn't walk into total silence when I got back. Loneliness arrived in stages, and then all at once. Every morning at 5, I'd reach across the mattress for Sarah and find cold sheets, the grief resetting fresh. I ate standing at the counter because sitting alone at a table felt like a declaration. I left the TV on for the voices. I took extra weekend runs because the truck had destinations and the apartment had only walls. The first holiday alone was Thanksgiving. Another driver I ran routes with, Danny Kowalski, invited me to his house in Knoxville. His wife Carolyn cooked a turkey. His 3 kids argued about drumsticks and spilled cranberry sauce on the tablecloth. I sat at their table smiling and eating and answering questions, and afterward I drove back to Alcoa on I-40 in the dark, passing the Cookville exit, passing the pilot station, and I pulled into my apartment complex parking lot and sat in the F-150 for 20 minutes with the engine off, unable to go inside, unable to face the silence that waited on the other side of a door I'd come to dread opening. Christmas was worse than Thanksgiving. Danny invited me again, and I went because the alternative was sitting alone in an Alcoa apartment on December 25th with a television playing to an empty room. His kids had grown since I'd last seen them at Thanksgiving, or maybe I was just noticing things differently now that I knew I'd never watched children of my own grow. His youngest, Emma, who was 7, asked me at dinner if I was sad. Children see things that adults have learned to overlook. I told her I was fine, and she looked at me with that devastating frankness that only a 7-year-old can produce and said, "You look sad." Carolyn changed the subject, but Emma had been right, and the fact that a child could see through me when a room full of adults couldn't bothered me for weeks afterward. Parked in rest areas and loading docks, thinking about how a first grader had read my face more accurately than I'd been able to read my own wife's for 9 months. Danny came down one Sunday with Yingling and sat on the stoop outside my apartment door while I told him the whole story from beginning to end. The odometer, the spreadsheet, the GPS dot on Maple Lane, Dale's photographs, Sarah's face when I said, Gainsborough. Danny listened the way he always does, quietly, forearms on his knees. When I finished, he said something I've carried with me on every run since. You spent your whole marriage trying to fix something that wasn't broken. You and Sarah weren't broken. The situation was broken. And sometimes a broken situation breaks the people inside it, no matter how much they want to hold on. I don't know if that's the whole truth, but it was the kindest thing anyone said to me during that stretch, and I turned it in my head for months afterward like a stone in a pocket, wearing it smooth until it fit perfectly in my hand. 3 months after the divorce, I sat in a therapist's waiting room in Maryville. Dr. Linda Marsh, silver hair, reading glasses on a chain, an office that smelled like lavender. She asked what brought me in. I said my wife cheated and we got divorced. She said that's what happened, but what brought me here was something different. Then she waited. I said I felt like a failure, couldn't father children, couldn't keep a marriage, didn't know what shape a man's life was supposed to take when the two things he'd built everything around were both gone. She said we had work to do, and she was glad I'd come. Sessions were 50 minutes, $150 after insurance. By the 4th visit, I was crying in ways I hadn't cried in 20 years, the emptying kind that leaves you lighter and frightened by the lightness. We talked about how I'd grieved by refusing to grieve, burying loss under overtime miles and spreadsheet data. How our wound became a wall instead of a bridge. How my parents' divorce had taught me silence was safer than questions, which is why I bought a GPS tracker instead of sitting at my own kitchen table and asking my wife where she was going every Wednesday. The hardest session was the 6th one. Dr. Marsh asked me to describe the moment I felt closest to Sarah during our marriage, and I told her about the night before the first IVF procedure. We'd been lying in bed in the dark, and Sarah had turned to me and said, "Promise me we'll be okay no matter what happens tomorrow." And I'd said, "I promise." She asked me what I'd meant by that promise, and I said I'd meant that I'd love Sarah regardless of whether we could have children. Then she asked if I'd kept that promise, and I opened my mouth to say yes, and nothing came out. Because the truth was, I hadn't. I'd kept the form of the promise, the staying, the providing, the physical presence of a man in a house, but I hadn't kept its substance. I'd retreated into the road and the numbers and the silence, and in doing so, I'd left Sarah alone with a grief that was meant to be shared. And she'd gone looking for someone to share it with. That realization nearly broke me in Dr. Marsh's office that afternoon, and I sat in her parking lot for 30 minutes afterward before I was steady enough to drive. Therapy didn't fix things the way I'd hoped. It reorganized them. Dr. Marsh helped me see that the anger I thought I was carrying toward Sarah was actually pointed at myself, at the version of me who'd spent a decade driving away from grief instead of sitting down in the middle of it and letting it teach me what it needed to teach me. She showed me that the infertility hadn't ruined my marriage. The silence around the infertility had. If Sarah and I had learned to talk about the thing that was killing us, she might never have needed to find a stranger on the internet who would listen. I'm not excusing what she did. I'm just saying I finally understood the soil it grew in, and some of that soil was mine. The sessions peeled back layers, and each layer hurt worse than the one above it, but the hurting was productive, like the pain of a bone being set correctly after healing crooked. It pointed towards something better, even while it made me wince. 6 months after the divorce, on a Clarksville run, I drove through Gainsborough and passed the turnoff to Maple Lane. I looked down that street. Just a house, vinyl siding, chain link fence, a dog in the yard. A place where two broken people found comfort because neither could carry the weight alone. Something shifted in my chest. Not forgiveness, something adjacent. Understanding. Through Danny, I heard that Sarah and Greg had moved in together in Cookville. A year later, that they'd adopted a baby girl named Lily. That news hit like a blow I hadn't braced for. She was a mother. living the life we'd spent $23,000 and 7 years trying to build. Dr. Marsh helped me see the pain wasn't about Sarah anymore. It was about the ghost of a future I'd imagined for 20 years that had never materialized. I needed to mourn that ghost properly before I could construct anything new. So I mourned it. In a lavender-scented office, 50 minutes at a time, with a woman who asked questions I didn't have answers to, and waited patiently while I found them. Mourning a ghost is different from mourning a person. A person leaves behind memories you can hold on to, photographs that make sense, a timeline you can trace from beginning to end. A ghost future leaves behind nothing except the absence of what was supposed to be there. I mourned the bedtime stories I'd never read, the school plays I'd never attend, the first steps and first words and first days of school that existed only in my imagination and now had to be dismantled piece by imaginary piece and filed away in the part of my mind labeled things that will not happen. It took months. It took Dr. Marsh's quiet, persistent questions. It took more crying than I'd done in my entire adult life prior to that year. But eventually, the mourning did what mourning is supposed to do. It cleared space. And in that space, small and tentative, something new began to grow. I started building. Small things first, because small things were all I had the strength for. I adopted a hound mix named Biscuit from the Blount County Animal Shelter on a Tuesday afternoon in April. He was 3 years old with mournful brown eyes and a tail that never stopped moving, and the shelter volunteers said he'd been returned twice by families who didn't have time for him. I said I had more time than I knew what to do with. I paid a neighbor's teenager named Kyle $20 a day to walk him and fill his water bowl during my road trips. Having a living creature waiting at the door when I came home changed everything. The apartment wasn't empty when Biscuit was there, sprawled on the couch, thumping his tail against the cushions the second I turned the key in the lock. I'd sit on the floor with him in the evenings, his head on my knee, and for the first time in months, the silence felt companionable rather than accusing. A dog doesn't need you to explain why you're sad. He just needs you to be there. I bought a small Weber grill for the apartment patio and started cooking real meals on weekends instead of surviving on truck stop food and vending machine sandwiches. I joined a gym called Iron House that smelled like rubber mats and ambition, and I started lifting 3 mornings a week before my runs, feeling the physical effort ground me in my body in ways the road never had. I joined a Thursday evening divorce support group at a Maryville community center called New Chapter, 12 men arranged in folding chairs in a room with fluorescent overhead lighting and a coffee maker that produced a liquid loosely resembling coffee, led by a retired family counselor named Tom, who had been through divorce twice himself and had the kind of weathered, gentle authority that comes from surviving your own worst decisions. We told our stories, we listened without judgment, and slowly, the loneliness lost its sharpest teeth, not because it vanished, but because I learned it was a condition I shared with every man in that circle, and shared conditions are easier to carry than solitary ones. The support group taught me something I don't think I could have learned anywhere else. It taught me that men grieve differently than the culture tells us we're supposed to, and that the gap between how we actually feel and how we're permitted to express it is where most of the damage accumulates. Every man in that circle had a version of the same story, a loss he wasn't allowed to show, a wound he was expected to walk off, a silence that society mistook for strength. Tom, the facilitator, called it the armor problem. We build armor to survive, he said, and then we can't take it off when the battle's over. And the armor becomes the prison. I thought about my Peterbilt, about the way I'd used the cab of that truck as armor for years, sealing myself inside steel and glass and diesel noise so I didn't have to hear the silence in my own house. Tom was right. The armor had kept me alive, and it had kept me alone, and the two outcomes were so tangled together, I couldn't separate them without help. 2 years have passed. I still drive for Ridgeline. I upgraded to a 2-bedroom, so Biscuit has room and Danny's kids can stay over. I see Dr. Marsh every other week. I still photograph odometers, but only my own now, a habit too old and too ingrained to break. Last month on a Wednesday evening, I stopped at the Pilot near Cookeville, the same station where Sarah used to refuel on her way to Gainsborough. I went inside for coffee and sat at a booth by the window, watching headlights sweep the parking lot. A woman at the next table looked up from a paperback and asked if the coffee was any good. I said it was truck stop coffee, meaning it was hot and it existed, and she laughed. Her name was Ellen, 43, a nurse at Cookeville Regional, divorced, with a grown son in the Army. We talked for 20 minutes about nothing consequential. She said she stopped there most Wednesday evenings after her late shift. I drove home with the radio on for the first time in months. It wasn't a beginning, just a conversation and bad coffee, and a reminder that the road runs in both directions. I don't know what comes next. I'm 43, childless, divorced, living with a hound dog in an apartment, driving a Peterbilt for a living, paying into a life that bears no resemblance to the blueprint I drew at 26. But I've learned things. Love doesn't shield you from loss. Shared pain can divide as easily as it binds. The numbers on an odometer tell you where someone traveled, but never why. And sometimes the bravest thing a man can do isn't fight or investigate or hire a detective. Sometimes it's letting go of the life you wanted and starting to build the one you have. 1 mile at a time. 1 morning at a time. 1 Wednesday evening at a truck stop at a time. Justice had been served, though it was quiet justice, nothing dramatic. The guilty were just people who handled unbearable pain badly, and I count myself among them. But the truth had surfaced, and the lies had ended. And in the space where deception used to live, something fragile and honest had begun to grow. Not between me and Sarah, inside me. Healing had begun. Slowly, imperfectly, with setbacks and sleepless nights and mornings when the empty bed still cut deep. But it had begun. And for now, that was enough. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section below. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. We will see you in the next one.